Tommy Tomlinson of ESPN, the magazine, joining me here now on the Rich Eisen Show. Thanks for calling in, Tommy.
Thank you, Rich. I appreciate it.
You bet. So the piece that you wrote was about Dean Smith's fading memories and how he became ill and took ill and how he was robbed of everything that made him, in many ways, who he was. What are your thoughts on his passing, Tommy?
Well, it's been gratifying to hear all the people in the last couple of days talking about Dean not just as a brilliant basketball mind, which he was, but as sort of a molder of people and a teacher in ways that went way beyond basketball. But I think it's also interesting, and I think there's been some of this that got into the sort of the complicated nature of Dean. He was a person who avoided the limelight, didn't like it, but he had a job that put him right in the middle of it. And so he sacrificed his, comfort for being out front and being in the middle of, national TV and lots of recognition and that sort of thing for the things that he thought were important to him in terms of coaching basketball and teaching life in a way. And I think also something that's come out and people have talked about, which is true, was that he was just a good basketball coach and a very competitive person. Did not come across that way in person necessarily. I think tried to downplay some of that, but he wanted to win basketball games and had won more of them than anybody else when he retired.
Tommy Tomlinson, the author of Precious Memories, a story that he wrote, posted on ESPN, the magazine, and on its website, March 5th of 2014. Joining me here, dementia taking its toll on Dean Smith. What was your first person experience in seeing that? Were you let in on that, I guess, private area of his life, Tommy?
A little bit. I mostly through speaking to Linnea Smith, Dean's wife. Dean's family, well, first of all, when Dean was engaged and more aware, he was always very protective of his family. He didn't want his kids talking in the media, that sort of thing, because he just thought they were private citizens and there was no need for them to have to talk to somebody about him. Well, when Dean started losing his faculties, in a sense, I think it kind of flipped around and his family became very protective of him. It took me months to sort of get through to the point where Linnea would agree to sit down and talk to me. And by the time that I was doing my story, Dean was having, the moments when Dean was sort of engaged with the world were pretty rare. And so I didn't see any of those moments. People told me stories that I wrote about in my piece, but I didn't get to see any of that. The time I saw Dean most was when I was at their home speaking to Linnea for my story, and his caregiver brought him in. He had been at the Smith Center where he used to go 2 or 3 times a week. The family had hoped that that would sort of engage him some and trigger some memories. So they brought him back that day that I was there, and he was asleep, and he had kind of run out of energy for the day. So I did not get to see him up close so much in that way, but certainly from his family and friends and other people who cared about him, I saw the bigger picture.
Your latest piece, The Lessons of Dean Smith, is also something that people should seek out. So what would you say is Dean Smith's greatest achievement, Tommy?
I think it's the players he put out into the world. He put out a lot of people who are not just good basketball players, although there's a ton of good basketball players, but people in the community. Just in Charlotte where I live, there's Bobby Jones is here, and he's a longtime basketball coach and kind of a molder of young men himself. A guy named David Chadwick is here. He's a pastor in town. The guy I think about the most when I think about Dean is a guy named Richard Vinroot. Richard Vinroot played for Dean in his early coaching days, and his entire career at UNC, he scored 1 point, 1 free throw in 1 game. He later went to Vietnam. He became mayor of Charlotte, very powerful lawyer here in town. And he and Dean are just as close as I suspect Dean and Michael Jordan are. And I think so many people who played for Dean and worked with him respected how well he treated the players on his team who were not stars. And those people, as much as the star players, would have to become good human beings in the community. And I think that's probably Dean's biggest legacy.
And then even in terms of the star players, Tommy, I read that Jerry Stackhouse said he still sent financial statements to Dean Smith on a weekly or monthly basis. It's remarkable.
Yeah, well, people had asked him about their marriages, about their divorces, about sneaker contracts. The little thing I had in my story today, Kenny Denard, who didn't even play for Dean, he played at Duke, but Dean had recruited him. When Kenny got into the NBA, he had a dispute with his team over an injury, and the team didn't want to pay him. And so Dean called Doug Moe, who was coaching the Denver Nuggets at the time. Doug had played for Dean when Dean was his assistant, and basically said, can you work something out? And so Denver made a trade for Kenny Denard, and he played his last year in Denver. And so, even guys who didn't play for Dean, but were in his orbit in some way, he took it upon himself to sort of be a combination father figure and advisor and guru.
Tommy, I really appreciate you calling in. Your work certainly on this is must-read stuff, and thanks for calling in and sharing.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Rich. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet.
The Rich Eisen Show, weekdays at noon Eastern. On Audience.